Right, we're on DAF Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, and I just want to remind us where we were. We learned yesterday in the Mishnah something that seemed a little surprising, which is that anyone can really write a get, even a chereshoit of a katan, someone who's not of sound mind. And the Gemara had questioned that because doesn't the Torah say v'chas avla that you have to write a get for the sake of the woman? How can someone who doesn't have the mental capacity accomplish that? So we had Rav Nachman come up with an answer. Rav Nachman says that Eidei Chasima Karsi, that he's of the opinion that you need signatures of the witnesses in the get itself, and therefore our Mishnah is going like Rabbi Meir. So when the Torah says you have to write a get for the sake of the woman, it's not referring to the actual text of the get, it's referring to the signatures of the witnesses. And so therefore, the text of the get can be written by anybody. It could even be photocopied. It doesn't have to be written lishma at all. I'm going to ask somebody to please call extension 300 on their cell phones of the shul and ask maintenance to turn on the heat in here, if I could, please. Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Okay. I hope Alan, make sure we're paying our bills. Okay.
I'm going to check that.
Okay.
The lights are still on.
Yeah, right. Okay. Okay, so now the Gemara says, we're up to, it's about 10 lines from the top. Amar of Nachman, Omer Haya Reb Meir, Afilu Mitzo Ba'ashba, Chasmo V'nasnu L'Kasher. On the basis of what we've just said, according to Reb Meir, even if you find the get in the garbage, as long as the witnesses sign it for the particular intended person, it's okay. Now, of course, you have to be really lucky. It's like winning the jackpot. If you find a get in the garbage, it has to have the name of the man, the name of the woman, and the name of the city, coincidentally, that is in accord with the person who wishes to divorce his wife. The point, however, is that it doesn't have to, the text does not have to be written lishma according to Reb Meir, as long as the witnesses sign it with the knowledge that they're doing it with the intent of the the date would have to be put in the get also. It would have to have been written that day and thrown in the garbage. Thank you. Thank you. What?
You're dumped.
Yeah. Okay. So now the Gemara says, Eisvei Rav Rav Nachman. So Rav challenges Rav Nachman and he says, V'chasav la lishma. Doesn't the Torah say that you have to write a get for the sake of the woman? So how can you use a get that's found in the garbage? How could our Mishnah allow a chereshoit of a katan to write a get? So my lav ksivas haget lo chasimas eidim. So our assumption is that refers to the text of the get. So the Gemara says no, it's not the text; it's actually the signatures of the witnesses. Eis ve'rava kol get shenichtav shelo l'shem isha pasul. But what about the following brisa? The brisa says any get that's written not for the sake of the woman is pasul. So you see that the text also has to be written for her. So Rav Nachman will answer, no. Ema shenechtam shelo l'shem isha pasul. It really means that if it was not signed by the Edom for the sake of that particular woman, it's pasul. But the text itself, we don't care. Eisvei, let's look at another brisa. Kishuhu kosvo ki'ilu kosvo lishma. This brisa says that when you write it, you have to write it as if it was written lishma. Now, what is the word it referring to? And what does it mean as if you're writing it lishma? So the Gemara's assumption is that you're writing a portion of the text of the get, and that what it means is my lav kishu kosva l'toref lishma kilu kosva l'tofes lishma. It seems like what the Bryce is saying is that when you write it, it's as if you're writing it for its proper intent. And so what the Gemara is assuming is, we know from our previous studies that there are two portions of the get. There's the Toref, which contains the specific information, the man, the woman, the place, the date. And then the rest of the get has the generic text of he's divorcing her and he sends her on her way, and so forth and so on. So our assumption is that when you're writing the Toref, which is the specifics, when you're writing the tofes, which is the generic part, even if you're not writing it lishma, it's as if you're writing it lishma as long as the toref is written lishma. So when you're writing the specifics lishma, it's as if you're writing the tofes lishma, even if the tofes lishma was written beforehand generically without anyone in mind. And therefore, at least what you see from this brisa, that at least a portion of the text has to be written lishma. So that's again a kasha on Rav Nachman. So the Gemara says, "Lo kishu chosmo lishma kilu kosva lishma." So Rav Nachman says, "No, there's another way to learn that brisa. It really means that when you are signing the get as an aid, as long as the signing is done lishma, it's as if you've written the entire get lishma." So all of these questions are lodged at Rav Nachman from brises, and Rav Nachman says these brises are not a challenge because I can reread them as referring to the signing by the witnesses, not the writing of the get. But now the Gemara says, "V'boyis ema hani masnisa mani Rabbi Elazar hi damar edei mesira karti." Another answer could be that all of those brises that you, Rava, have presented to me as a challenge go according to Rabbi Elazar, who says there are no necessary witnesses signing on the get, and therefore when the Torah says v'kosav la, it can't be referring to signatures, it must be referring to the text itself of the get. But there's a fundamental machlokes on that issue between Reb Meir and Rabbi Elazar. So just because you quote a brisa that disagrees with Rabbi Meir is not a challenge, because those go according to Rabbi Elazar. Now, Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Now, Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, don't like Rav Nachman's answer. Rav Nachman had said that our entire Mishnah goes according to Rav Meir, which does not require the writing of the text lishma, and that's why a chereshoita v'katan can write the get. However, they're not happy with that. They say that no, there's another way of understanding our Mishnah. V'hu shashir makom atoref, that our Mishnah would require that even though it allows a chereshoita v'katan to write a get, but only writing the tofes, the generic part, which does not have to be written lishma. But they would have to leave over the specifics, what's called the toref, and allow someone who is lucid to write that part lishma for the sake of the woman. V'chein omer Rav Chaga mishmei de'ula v'hu shashir makom atoref. Rav Chaga says in the name of Ula the exact same thing, that our Mishnah is only permitting a chereshoita v'katan to write the generic part, not the specific part, the Rabbi Elazar he. And our Mishnah really does go according to Rabbi Elazar, who says the text has to be written lishma, but only the text, the portion of the text that it has the specifics, his name, her name, the date, the time, the place, etc. V'Rebbi Zreika Amar Rabbi Yochanan Eina Torah. But Rabbi Zreika says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that's not Torah. In other words, I don't accept that explanation. My Eina Torah. Amar Rebbe Abba Kano Diacha She'in Koach Lishma V'Reb Meir Hi Da'amar Eidi Chasim Akarti. That really, what does that mean? It means that what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that our Mishnah does not go like Rabbi Elazar. Actually, the whole point of our Mishnah is to say that we don't paskin like Rabbi Elazar, and that we don't require any portion of the get to be written lishma, and that's why a chereshoita and katan can write it. Why? Because our Mishnah goes like Rabbi Meir, who says that Eidei Chasima Karti, and as long as the witnesses are signed on it lishma, nothing else needs to be lishma. So now the Gemara raises a contradiction within Rabbi Yochanan himself. Amar Rabba bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Elazar. Didn't Rabba bar Chana quote the very same Rabbi Yochanan as saying that our Mishnah does go like Rabbi Elazar? How can now another Talmud quote Rabbi Yochanan as saying that he holds that our Mishnah goes like Rabbi Meir? The Gemara answers Amaroi Ninhu va'aliba de Rabbi Yochanan. Very simple answer. It's a machlokes Amoraim as to what the Rebbe said. So one Talmud says that Rabbi Yochanan interprets our Mishnah like Rabbi Elazar, and the other Talmud says that Rabbi Yochanan interpreted our Mishnah like Rabbi Meir. Bottom line is, this is a long-standing machlokes that we see throughout Maseches Gittin, whether the get needs to be written, the text of the get needs to be written lishma. It's dependent upon the machlokes as to whether you need chasimas of Edim signatures in the get or not. If you hold like Rabbi Meir that you need Edim signatures in the get, so that's the part that needs to be written lishma, and the rest of the text can be written shelo lishma. But if you hold like Rabbi Elazar, who says that you don't need witnesses' signatures in the get, then it turns out that the text itself has to be, or at least a portion of the text, what we call the Toref, has to be written lishma. Let us go weiter. Yes?
Do the Torah and the Tofes have to be written at the same time? Or can you have the Torah?
Ostensibly, it seems that it doesn't have to be written the same time, because since the Torah can be written Shalol Lishma, you could pick it up from a stationery store and just fill in the top part according to what we're saying.
What's the current halacha?
We don't paskin that way. We paskin that the entire get has to be written from scratch. Okay.
For that person.
For that specific person. Next Mishnah. Hakol kesherin la'avi es haget chutz mecheres shoyte v'katan v'suma v'ovi kochavim. Everyone is kosher to transport a get. Now, our previous Mishnah had dealt with who's kosher to write a get. Now we're dealing with who's the delivery person. Everyone can act as the delivery person, from the man to the woman, except for cheres shoyte v'katan, someone who's not of sound mind, v'suma, a blind person also cannot, and an Ovi Kochavim also cannot. A Gentile cannot either. Now we're going to see why. Kibel hakatan v'higdil cheresh v'nispakeach suma v'nispateach shoyta v'nishtafe Ovi Kochavim v'niskayer pasel. He says, and therefore, and because at the time when the get gets into the shaliach's hands, he has to be kosher. If, let's say, he was not kosher at the time that he got into his hands, but by the time he's ready to deliver it, he is kosher, it's going to be pasel. So, for example, he accepts the get as a minor and then has his bar mitzvah en route. Or he was a deaf mute when he received the get, but was cured by the time he got to the woman. He was blind when he received the get and becomes sighted by the time he's ready to deliver. He was a Gentile when he received the get and was Magayer on the way to giving the get. In all of those cases, even though by the end of the delivery he's kosher, but since he started the delivery process by receiving the get in a non-kosher state, the delivery process is possible. Avol pikeach v'nischaresh v'chazer v'nispakeach, pasuach v'nistame v'chazer v'nispateach, shafoy v'nishtate v'chazer v'nishtafeh, kasher. But what would happen if he was kosher upon receipt of the get and kosher upon delivery of the get, but in the middle, en route, he became non-kosher? So these are the examples. Let's say that he was of a lucid mind when he got the get, went temporarily insane, and then recovered by the time he's ready to deliver the get. Or let's say he was sighted and then became temporarily blind and then became sighted again. Or he was, in all of those kinds of situations, then it will be kosher, since upon receipt and upon delivery he's kosher. Zeh klal, and therefore the general rule is kol shenitchilasa v'sofa b'das kosher. That as long as he starts off lucid and ends off lucid, it's kosher, even if in the interim there was an interruption in his kashrus as a shaliach. And the Gemara will explain all of this. The Gemara now says, Bishlam acheres shoyte v'katan delav b'nei deyaninu. I can certainly understand that in order to act as a shaliach, you have to be of sound mind. We learn from the laws of Korban Pesach, as Rashi quotes from the pasuk in Sefer Shemos, it says, "V'yikchu lahem ish selaves avos selaboyas." Every group shall assign a man to take a lamb, and a man means that he has to be an adult who is of sound mind. So we know that anytime you're memana a shaliach, the shaliach has to be of sound mind, and that's why a cheres shoyte v'katan cannot act as a shaliach. But oive kochavim nami delav bar heterahu. I can also understand why a Gentile is not kosher, because he's not part of that category of mitzvah who can release his wife through a get. In other words, all the laws of marriage and divorce are given to the Jewish people. The method of marriage and divorce for a Gentile are totally different. They don't work using the prescribed methods of the Torah. And therefore, since he himself cannot fulfill the mitzvah of get, he cannot act as a shaliach for somebody else to deliver a get. You have to be able, as someone else's shaliach, I have to be within the category of that mitzvah in order to be able to do the mitzvah for somebody else. So I understand why a goy cannot act as the shaliach on the get. Elasuma amaylo. But the question is, why can't a blind person be a shaliach on a get? So Rav Sheshes is very simple. How's he supposed to know who's giving it to him and who's going to deliver it to? It could be anyone, right? Like that famous scene in Young Frankenstein with Gene Hackman and the monster. He doesn't know who it is, right? If you remember that scene. Okay, so Maskifla Rav Yosef, Heich Suma Mutter Beishto, Heich Bnei Adam Mutar Bin Shosehem Balayla. So Rav Yosef says, he says, what are you talking about? Blind people, if you're going to tell me that they have no idea who they're interacting with, then how can a blind person ever be with his wife? Maybe it's not his wife. Maybe he's committing adultery. And for that matter, even non-blind people, sighted people, if it's pitch dark at night, how are they supposed to know if it's their wife or not? What right do they have? So I actually quoted a medrash this Shabbos about a woman named Shlomis Bas Divri who was exploited based on the darkness. Another man took advantage of her. But generally we don't. What? Rachel and Leah. But generally we don't say that. Generally we say that what? Ela b'tvius eina dekala, hachanam b'tvius eina dekala. So under normal circumstances, we say that in the dark you can recognize it's your wife based on her voice and so forth. And so why can't we say that a blind person can detect who he's getting the get from and who he's delivering it to? That can't be the issue. So Ela Amar Rav Yosef Hacha b'chutz l'aaretz askinan deboy lameimar b'fanai nichtav u'b'fanai nechtam v'lo matzi lameimar. So rather the issue is that we're dealing with a delivery of a get from chutz la'aretz, where we know that the delivery person has to say, it was signed and it was written and signed in my presence. And he cannot testify that he didn't see it. He may detect that it was done, but he can't say it definitively, and that's the chisaron. That's the deficiency in his delivery of the get. Amar le Abaye. So Abaye says, by that reasoning, Elame'ata pasuach v'nistapei dematzi Amar hachinami dekasher? Question mark. So are you going to argue by virtue of that argument that if he was cited at the time of receiving the get, where he could witness the writing and the signing of the get, if he became blind en route, even if he remained blind at the time of delivery to the woman, are you going to tell me that the get is kosher, since he can detect who he's giving it to? Right? So the Gemara says, if you're going to say that, v'hakatani pasuach v'nistame v'chazer v'nitpateach kosher, chazer v'nitpateach in, lo chazer v'nitpateach lo, then why did our Mishnah say that he has to be cited at the beginning and cited at the end? It should have just said that he only has to be cited at the beginning when he receives the get, but he doesn't have to be cited upon delivery. So the Gemara says, Hu adin dafal gav de lo chazer v'nitpateach. Va'aydi de katani shafoy v'nishtateh v'chazar v'nishtafeh taima de chazer v'nishtafeh holo chazer v'nishtafeh lo tananami pasuach v'nistameh v'chazar v'nitpateach. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you the truth. The truth is that you're right. As long as he was cited when he received the get, even if he's blind by the time he delivers the get, he can say b'fanai nechtav or b'fanai nechtam, and it's kosher. Why then did the Mishnah say he's got to be cited at the beginning and at the end? The answer is for symmetry, because the language of the Mishnah also addressed the person who was lucid and then went insane. In that case, he has to be both lucid at the beginning and at the end in order to fulfill the shlichus. And the only thing that we allow for is temporary insanity in the interim. So because that case requires both lucidity at the beginning and at the end, it mentions cited status at the beginning and at the end. But in reality, he only has to be cited at the beginning. He doesn't have to be cited at the end. So Amar Ravashi Dikanami Dekatani Zeh Klal Kol shetchilasa v'sofa b'das kasher, v'lo ketani kol shetchilasa v'sofa b'kashrus kasher shmamina. Rav Ashi says, I can actually infer that that's the halacha from the last line of the Mishnah. The last line of the Mishnah said the general rule is that if someone is lucid at the beginning and end of their shlichus, that person is kosher. Now, why say lucid? You should be more expansive, more generic, and say anyone who is kosher at the beginning and at the end. The delivery of the get is kosher. It doesn't say that because the Mishnah is only requiring beginning and end when it comes to lucidity. But when it comes to sightedness, the Mishnah does not require beginning and end. It only requires beginning and not end. So Rav Ashi says that in itself is implicit in the language of the Mishnah. Bo minei me Rebbe Ami. Eved mahu sheyaseh shaliach lekabel get isha miyad baila. So it's a funny way of phrasing the question, and Rashi says it's a more generic question. Can an Eved Kanani be a shaliach for a get? Can he either be the woman's shaliach or the man's shaliach to deliver the get or to receive the get? And we said that a Gentile cannot. What about an Eved Kanani? Eved Kanani is a Gentile, but he's chayiv in mitzvahs nonetheless. So Amar lahu midikapasale laoved kochavim michlal de Eved kosher. So his answer was, well, the Mishnah only disqualifies a complete Gentile, but if an Eved Kanani is chayiv in certain mitzvahs, and therefore it sounds like from a Mishnah that he can be a shaliach. So Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Ein ha'eved nasa shaliach lekabel get liisha miyad baila, lefi she'eno b'toras gittin v'kiddushin. So Rav Asi says in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, I disagree. No, an Eved Kanani cannot be a shaliach. You know why he cannot be a shaliach? Because since the laws of gittin and kiddushin do not apply to him, he cannot be a shaliach for someone else. As we mentioned by a Gentile, the reason why he can't be a shaliach is because he's not in the parsha of that mitzvah. The laws of kiddushin and gittin don't apply to him. The same argument can be made by an Eved Kanani, and therefore he's not allowed to be the shaliach. So maskef la Rebbe Lazar, taima b'milsa delese ha b'milsa de'isei kosher. So according to that argument, are you suggesting that if an Eved Kanani is in the parsha, or a goy for that matter, is in the parsha of a certain mitzvah, he could act as a shaliach? So if that's the case, v'ha'obe kochavim v'hakusi de'isnu b'toras truma denafshayu, let's look at a case of trumas and maestros. We know that if a goy lives in Eretz Yisrael, an Arab owns a piece of property, we know that we're not going to obligate him to take trumas and maestros. It's not one of the shiva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. However, if he voluntarily takes truma, then that truma has the halachic status of truma because he's taking it, it has kedushas haaretz. So if he declares it to be truma, his tithing is tithing. And therefore we know that he's in the parsha of that mitzvah. And ditnan ha'obikol chavim ve'hakusi shetarmu mishalahem trumasam truma. If they tithe their own produce, that produce has the status of truma. And it can only be eaten by a kohen. And yet, even though they're in the parsha of that mitzvah, Utznan obikol chavim shetarm shel Yisrael afilu birishus ein truma so truma. But if a Yisrael instructs a Gentile to tithe for him, even though normally I can have a shaliach tithe for me, but if I have a goy tithe for me, it's not kosher. So my taima lav mishum dichsiv atem gam atem ma atem Yisrael af shluchachem Yisrael. It's based on the pasuk that's written by truma. There's an extra word gam. You shall tithe, but it says also you shall tithe. And from that extra word gam, we learn that just like you as the Yisrael have the mitzvah of tithing, so too your shaliach has to be a Jew. But according to what you said, a Gentile should be kosher. So Amri devei Rabbi Yanai lo ma'atem. So in other words, what we want to try and prove from here is that even though just like a goy is not kosher to tithe, an Eved should not be kosher to tithe as well, despite the fact that he's in the parsha of the mitzvah. So your whole argument as to the fact that because an Eved is not in the parsha, that's the reason why he can't deliver a get. Your argument then should be that he should be kosher for trumas and maestros, and yet we see from the pasuk that he's not. So Amri devei Rabbi Yanai lo ma'atem b'nei bris af shluchachem b'nei bris. So Rabbi Yanai teaches no, that pasuk is only coming to exclude bona fide Gentiles. But despite the fact that they can perform the mitzvah, the Torah gives a specific miyut. But when it comes to avadim and Eved Kanani, the Torah is not excluding him, because just like you are b'nei bris, you are part of a covenantal relationship with God because you're chayiv in additional mitzvos. So too, any person that's part of that covenantal mitzvah relationship is in the parsha of taking trumas and maisus, and therefore an Eved Kanani is kosher. And it turns out the way that the Gemara is learning now, it turns out like this. Really, an Eved cannot act as a shaliach in any case where he's not capable of doing that mitzvah, and the Torah even excludes him from being a shaliach and truma because of the special miyut of the pasuk of atem gam atem. Whereas an Eved Kanani can be a shaliach on certain things, is excluded from being a shaliach on things where he's not part of that mitzvah. But when it comes to truma, he is kosher to tithe because he's part of the b'nei bris, and so he's not excluded by the words atem gam atem. Amar Reb Chia bar Abba Amar Reb Yechanan ein ha'eved nasa shaliach lekabel get isha miyad baila lefi she'eno b'toras gittin v'kiddushin. So he says that an eved, like we just said before, cannot be a shaliach for a get because he's not part of that mitzvah of gittin and kiddushin. And then he makes another statement which seems to be a non sequitur. It seems to be totally unrelated. He says, "Ve'afal pisha shaninu hareat shivcha uvladech ben chorin im haisa ubra zach salo." Even though we've learned that that an eved can be a proxy for emancipation. Now, what does this mean? It means that I have the ability to appoint an eved to deliver a get shichur, to deliver a writ of emancipation on behalf of someone else. Now, this seems to make no sense. It shouldn't be an afal pi. This is not at all connected to the laws of gittin and kiddushin. So that's going to be the Gemara's next question. But let's understand the case that Rabbi Yochanan is addressing. A man owns a female slave. He gives her a get shichur, he gives her a writ of emancipation, and he says, this is not for you. This is for your unborn fetus. So by her taking hold of it, she can act as a shaliach for the unborn fetus, so that when the child is born as a free man and not as a slave. So the Gemara's question is, that's very interesting, but what does it have to do with the fact that an eved can act as a shaliach on gittin and kiddushin? That's for the reason that he's not part of the mitzvah. But obviously, one slave is part of the mitzvah of being emancipated, so this makes certainly good sense why they should be able to act as a shaliach. What's the connection between the two? Mayim haisu ubra zach salo. So that's the question. And the Gemara explains, Ki asa Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda Amar Rabbi Yochanan tarte Amar. That really Rabbi Yochanan was saying two halachos, and the afal pi is not going on as a contrast to the eved's inability to act as a shaliach on gittin and kiddushin, but really Rabbi Yochanan was speaking in shorthand and was saying two things about a writ of emancipation. Number one, nirim dvarim sha'eved mekabel get lechavero miyad rabo shel chavero, avalo miyad rabo shelo. The first halacha that Rabbi Yochanan said, which is implicit, which is not set out in this text, is that an eved can act as a shaliach to take a get shichur from a master on behalf of another slave, provided that that master is not his master. In other words, he's owned by somebody else. So therefore, he's allowed to act as a shaliach to take the get shichur on behalf of his friend, the slave, who is the slave of that guy who's giving him the get shichur. But if the guy who's giving him a get shichur is also his master, then he cannot act as a shaliach. And it's very simple. Why? Because the hand of an eved is like the hand of the master. So since I am the property of that man who's giving me the get shichur, by him giving me the writ of emancipation, it's as if he put it from one hand into his other hand. And therefore he is not delivering it at all through me. Therefore I cannot act as his shaliach. A shaliach has to be an independent party that can take independent possession of it. Since I'm his possession, I cannot act as a shaliach for the emancipation of somebody else. So the question then that leads into the next case, which is the case of the woman who's pregnant, is the next part. Vim licheshcha adam lomar zu halacha shenuyim haisa ubra zach salo. Doesn't that contradict the case of the woman who's pregnant? She's acting as a shaliach for her unborn fetus, and yet she's the possession of the master who's giving her the writ of emancipation. So how does it work? So, Emorlo, the answer is very simple. Shnei Gedolei Hador Pirshu Es Hadover Reb Zeir Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak. Two great Gedolei Hador explain this. You have to take their words together in order to understand the whole halacha. Chad Omer Hamani Rebbe Hi Omer Hameshachar Chatzi Avdo Kana. V'chad Omer My Time at the Rebbe Baha Kesaver Uber Yerech Imahu V'nasa Kemi Sheikna La Echad Me'avareha. The explanation works like this. That halacha, that a master can give his female slave a get shichur for her unborn fetus, works only according to Rebbe, who says that it is possible to free half of your slave. Let's say I own a slave, and I say to him, listen, I only need you part-time, I don't need you full-time. So I'm going to give you a get shichrur to free you halfway. Half of you is free, the other half belongs to me. So the Gemara says, so every other day he works for the master, and every other day he's on his own, right? So that's, and Rabbi says you can do that. You can free half a slave, right? So here too, when you give this female slave the get shichrur, you're not appointing her a shaliach to free her unborn fetus. Rabbi holds that uber yerechimo, that a fetus is an appendage of his mother. So you're basically saying to her, a portion of you is hereby emancipated. I'm emancipating that fetus part of you that's in your belly, that part of you is free, and the rest of you is a slave. So it's not working using the mechanism of shlichus, it's working the mechanism of the ability to free a portion of a person and not the entire person. And that's why it works. So that's what Rabbi Yochanan was saying. It's a totally independent halacha, having nothing to do with an eved acting as a shaliach for gittin and kiddushin. Let us go weiter. Af hanashim she'enon ne'emanos lomar meis baila ne'emanos lahavi es gita. We learned at the end of Yevamos that there was special leniency that the rabbis created for an aguna. They said that any person, including the woman herself, is believed to testify that her husband is dead. The Mishnah had then made an exception in Yevamos. It had said there are 5 women that we suspect would try to mess this woman up by lying. And because there's a natural hostility that exists between this woman and these 5 women. And who are they? So the Mishnah says, Chamosa, her mother-in-law. If her mother-in-law comes to court and testifies, my son is dead, we do not believe her. Ubas Chamosa, her sister-in-law, meaning her mother-in-law's daughter. Or Vitsarasa, her co-wife. Her Yevimta, a woman that is her husband's brother's wife. There too, there's natural animosity. Ubas Baila, and her stepdaughter, her husband's daughter. When those 5 women come forward to testify that the man is dead, we do not accept their testimony. However, this is where it's different by gittin. If these women bring a get, then they are believed, even with the understanding that there's natural hostility. Ma bein get lemisa shaksav mochiach. And what's the difference? Because we're not relying on their testimony, we're relying on the piece of paper that they're carrying, and therefore there's less of a likelihood that they're fabricating the whole thing. Ha'isha atzma mevias gita uvilvad shehitzricha lomer b'fanai nichtav u'b'fanai nechtam. And finally, the Mishnah says that a woman herself can act as the shliach for her own get. Let's say a husband gives his wife a piece of paper and says, "This is your get, but it's not going to become your get until you bring it to the BAYT in Eretz Yisrael and have them turn it into a get." So essentially, she's the shaliach for her own get until it gets to the BAYT. So as long as she can say b'fanai nechtam that I saw that the get was written and signed lishma, the get will be kosher, even though she's the one herself who's testifying. The Gemara now says v'hatanya kishem she'ein ne'emanos lomar meis ba'alech kach ein ne'emanos lahavi gita, that there's a brisa that directly contradicts our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that the 5 women who have natural hostility are believed when they bring a get. The brisa says just the opposite, that just like they're not believed to testify the man is dead, they're also not believed to transport the get. So how do you reconcile it? Amar of Yosef lo kasha kan ba'aretz kan b'chutz la'aretz. So the Gemara answers like this: in Eretz Yisrael is one halacha. When they're coming from Eretz Yisrael to another town in Eretz Yisrael is one halacha. When they're coming from chutz la'aretz is a different halacha. Ba'aretz the lava dibur didaka samchinan me'imna. B'chutz la'aretz the adibur didaka samchinan lo me'imna. And the way Rav Yosef explains it is like this: when a woman is transporting a get from one town in Eretz Yisrael to another, she doesn't have to say a word. And that's why we believe her, because we're relying exclusively on the piece of paper and not on her testimony. When she's coming from chutz la'aretz, since she has to say b'fanai nechtam, we need to rely on her testimony in order for the gets to be acceptable. we suspect that she's lying, and therefore we cannot accept her testimony. That's what the Bryce is referring to. So it turns out, the way Rav Yosef is explaining it, that our Mishnah, at least that line which talks about the 5 women, that says that they're okay, is only talking about when they're delivering it from one town in Eretz Yisrael to another. So Amar le Abaye Adarabba, Ibcha Mistavra, Ba'aretz Di'iyasi Bal Ma'ar Mashkechinon Bey, Di'ikal Amemar Likilkula Kamichavna Lo Mehimna. B'chutz La'aretz Di'iyasi Bal Ma'ar Lo Mashkechinon Bey, Mehimna. Abaya says, I would argue just the opposite. I agree with the distinction that you're making, Rav Yosef, that one of the 2 texts is talking about Eretz Yisrael, the other one is talking about Chutz La'aretz. But I would turn it just around. When do we believe one of these 5 women, despite their hostility? When they're coming from Chutz La'aretz. But when do we not believe? When they're coming from Eretz Yisrael. Now, why is that? What's the svar of a bias? You have to be a conspiracy theorist. Let's assume for a second that because of this hostility, the mother-in-law who's coming with the get wants to really mess up her daughter-in-law. So what is she trying to do? She's going to bring a forged get. She's going to falsely testify b'fanai nichtav of b'fanai nechtam. And that way, her daughter will think that she's a divorced woman. She'll go ahead and remarry, and her life will be destroyed. Her life will mamish be destroyed. She'll lose her first husband, she'll lose her second husband, and she'll have no life. So, that's typical. That sounds like a mother-in-law, right? Right. But anyway, but the problem is like this: she can't mess up her daughter-in-law if she's bringing a get from Chutz La'aretz. You know why? Because once she says b'fanai nichtav v'fanai nechtam in Beis Din ratifies the get, and the husband cannot appear afterwards and say, this is not true, I never wrote the get. So therefore, it's less likely that a mother-in-law will have the ability to destroy her daughter-in-law's life if she's coming from Chutz La'aretz. By contrast, when you deliver a get from one town in Eretz Yisrael to another town, from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim, let's say, there's no need for the Beis Din to ratify the get. As long as it's done in the presence of 2 witnesses, this woman can go on with her life. There, if the husband shows up and he says, this never happened, this is all a forgery, then we actually entertain the husband's protest, and we can actually nullify the get if the husband can bring evidence to what he's saying is correct, that he never authorized the get. So if anything, a mother-in-law coming from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim has more opportunity to destroy her daughter-in-law's life when it's in Eretz Yisrael than when it's from Chutz La'aretz. So that's why Abaya says, no, our Mishnah, which says that she is believed, is when she's coming from Chutz La'aretz, and the Brisa, which says that she's not believed, is when she's coming from Eretz Yisrael, exact opposite of Rav Yosef. So the Gemara now says, Tanya Kavase de Abaya. We have a Brisa to support Abaya's version, which is what we just spoke out, that the 5 women are only believed when they come from Chutz La'aretz, not when they come from Eretz Yisrael. What does the Brisa say? Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer Mishum Rabbi Akiva, Isha ne'emenes lahavi gita mikal v'chomer, that a woman herself, the woman herself in question, the divorcee, is believed when she transports her own get from a kal v'chomer. If the Chachamim take these 5 women who are normally not believed to testify that the man is dead, but they are believed to transport a get, so kal v'chomer her. He shene'emenes lamor meis baila eno din shene'emes lahavi gita. So then surely the woman herself, which the Chachamim trust her when she testifies that her own husband is dead, surely they'll believe her to transport her get. But then the Brisa continues and it says, Umi makom shabasa. But using that very same kal v'chomer, you have to conclude that the halacha is like this. Ma'ala alan tzricha shiyomer b'faneinu nichtav b'faneinu nechtam. Af hi tzricha shetomar b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam. Since we're using this kal v'chomer by comparing her to the 5 women, it also stands to reason that just like those 5 women have to say b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam, the woman herself has to say the very same thing. Now, the only way for this brisa to make sense, in what situations do we say b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam? Only when you're bringing a get from Chutz La'aretz. So you see, like Abaya says, these women are believed when they come from Chutz La'aretz, just as Abaya had said. Amar Avashi masnisa namidika dekatani haisha atzma mevia gita uvilvad shetei tzricha loymar b'fonai nechtav u'v'fonai nechtam shma mina. That the Mishnah also says the very same thing, that a woman herself is believed to say, this is my divorce paper, provided that she can say b'fonai nechtav u'v'fonai nechtam. So you clearly see from a Mishnah that we're talking about bringing a get from chutz la'aretz, and therefore that's the case of the 5 women as well. But the Gemara now says, "V'Rav Yosef reisha v'seifa b'chutz la'aretz mitziyasa ba'aretz?" Question mark. So Rav Yosef, how are you going to resolve this? The previous Mishnah talking about a blind person, and we said the reason he's not believed is he cannot say b'fonai nechtav v'fonai nechtam. So that was talking about chutz la'aretz. The case of a woman herself acting as her own shaliach is also talking about b'fonai nechtav v'fonai chutz la'aretz. So according to you, Rav Yosef, the only time that we believe the 5 women is when they come from Eretz Yisrael. You're telling me that the middle case shifts to Eretz Yisrael and is not chutz la'aretz? So the Gemara says, in Reisha v'Seifa b'chutz la'aretz mitziyasa ba'aretz. Yes, Taka, that's what Rav Yosef will tell you. That's how you have to understand our Mishnah. But wait a minute, mimai. But can you prove it from the text? Yes. Midikatani ma bein get lemisa shaksav mochiach. Below katani shaksav upe mochiach. He says, I'll look at the language. Because the language of our Mishnah said, what's the difference between testimony for the man's death versus a woman acting as a shaliach on the get? Why is it that we don't trust these 5 women to testify the man is dead, and we do believe them to testify to bring the get? So the Mishnah had answered, because one is we're relying on verbal testimony, and the other one was relying on the writ. Now, if we're coming from chutz la'aretz, it's not just we're relying exclusively on the writ. We also have to rely on their statement of b'fanai nechtav or b'fanai nechtam. So the fact that the Mishnah doesn't say that, it just is exclusively that we're relying on their writ, is indicative of the fact that the get is being brought from Eretz Yisrael, where they don't have to say anything. That proves, says Rav Yosef, the language of the Mishnah proves that we're talking about a get that's being delivered within Eretz Yisrael from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim. Because it doesn't say in the Mishnah that you're relying on both the paper and their testimony, just as you're just relying on the paper. So it's talking about a case where they didn't have to say b'fanai nechtav or b'fanai nechtam. I hope that was clear. Anyway, that's the machlokas. Have a wonderful day.